Hi, welcome to No Kill in Motion, a series from the No Kill movement. I'm joined today by Aubrie Kavanaugh, author of It's Not Rocket Science and leader of No Kill Huntsville, and Alan Rosenberg of New Jersey Animal Observer and a statistician analyst for No Kill movement. I'm Davyd Smith, president of No Kill Colorado, and we're talking today about some of the statistics that have been coming out during this COVID-19 change that we have. We are looking at the new math, looking at shelter data in COVID-19 world and what it means for the future. There's been a lot of data that has come out of Shelter Watch, KC Pet Project, and others. Alan has taken a really good look at these over the last week or so, and I want to start with him. Alan, what are you seeing this data saying?
So it's actually been an interesting time. PetPoint, which is a major provider of software to primarily animal shelters, but also some rescues, has been producing this weekly report of what is going on in all the animal shelters and I guess a few rescues that use their software compared since coronavirus happened to periods before coronavirus happened. And in particular, the period, the same time last year is what's interesting in terms of the comparisons. And one of the pieces of great news is that despite a lot of people's fears, including mine, animal shelters' live release rates have increased a good amount since coronavirus happened. So that is a really good piece of news that we saw from this data. The other thing is the media has been putting forth a narrative out there that shelters are empty, and they're empty because people are adopting out many more animals and fostering many more animals. And what the PetPoint data shows is those news stories are only partially correct. Shelters do, in fact, have significantly fewer animals in them now than before the pandemic. However, adoptions are actually way down from the prior year. And while fosters did increase the first few weeks after the coronavirus happened, they've kind of went the other way since then. And, when you look at the data collectively, dogs sent to foster since coronavirus compared to the prior year are about 15 to 20% up. But cats sent to foster during this year versus last year are actually down 20 to 25%. So really, shelters don't have fewer animals in them because of increased live outcomes. They're due to shelters taking in significantly fewer animals, which the PetPoint data shows. It's about 50% decrease in dog and cat intake combined since coronavirus happened compared to the same periods last year. So the million-dollar question really is, well, why is animal shelter intake decreasing? And I think there's some common sense things on the owner surrender side. I think people are under lockdown orders in many places, or were until recently, and shelters have been largely closed to people unless under extreme circumstances for taking an animal in. So I think those are driving why owner surrender numbers are down. And on the stray animal side, what has been interesting is data from KC Pet Project, which is the shelter in Kansas City. And they show that in Kansas City, since coronavirus happened, requests for animal control service, like, hey, pick up a stray dog or cat, are down nearly 65%.
Wow.
And again, when you look at that data, what it says to me is, hey, people are home with their animals, so the animals aren't getting loose without the owner being aware. And also people aren't out on the streets seeing dogs and cats roaming the streets and calling up animal control and say, hey, pick up this animal. So I think when we look at this data, it's quite telling to see, well, what's going to happen after the coronavirus happens. And in my opinion is after things normalize, and I know states and counties and municipalities are gradually opening themselves up, but I think ultimately, this intake reduction is a temporary thing. It's an event-driven thing. And if that's going to be maintained in the future, there's going to have to be a significant cultural change with that would drive it. So I don't think the public became immediately aware of, hey, we don't want to take animals to shelters anymore. I think it's really pandemic driven.
That really interesting numbers, and I want to stop you there so I get Aubrie to talk about, well, with what Alan just said. How do you see all that working, maybe where you are or just across the country in general?
Well, what I see locally actually bears out what Alan has seen in the data. What I keep hearing on the media is that it's all driven by adoptions and fosters. And while I will agree that more people are fostering, and that's great, we have more people that now are aware that fostering is a really easy way to help an animal. We learn about their personalities so we can get them in new homes quick, and we're keeping them out of shelters where they're stressed. What I'm seeing in my area is that the intake is drastically reduced. And so that's what's driving a lot of this data. Without trying to remember off the top of my head, when I got the data from the City of Huntsville City Attorney's Office for the month of April, which we seek every month, we seek the statistics for the prior month and what they call the E-report, the euthanasia report. Intake for both dogs and cats was down more than 60%. So we had a record low number of dogs entering the system at all, let alone entering the building. And we had a record low number of cats entering the system. And of those dogs that entered the system, meaning there was some record created for them as an intake, a lot of them were diverted into foster homes. So like somebody finds a dog running loose, they contact the shelter, they say, hey, I found this loose dog. The shelter says, gosh, can you please foster to keep that animal out of the building? An intake is still done. Information is submitted about where the animal was found, description, photographs, that kind of thing. So what we're really seeing is what Alan said, it's really that the intake is way low. I tend to agree with Alan that I think that this is driven by a current crisis. I think that once things normalize, I think that we will see that number go up because more people will be contacting animal control about animals running at large. People that have gone back to work, well, then maybe that's when your dog jumps the fence or somebody leaves the door open. So I think that we are going to see those numbers go back up. What I'm hopeful about is two things. Number one, we have a much more engaged public than we did before. So hopefully the public that has been fostering will continue to foster. Hopefully people will continue to take extraordinary steps to keep their pets contained, and that we will continue to reduce the intake while still getting animals out. But I think this is kind of an anomaly in time. I think that while we should work on program development and try to figure out how can we hold on to this new way of functioning moving forward, I don't think it's going to be the same. Now, we do hear a lot of shelters working on plans to be more involved with being community oriented and helping to keep animals in existing homes or keep them from getting loose in the first place. And to the extent shelters do more community outreach to reduce intake, I'm all about that. I mean, we for years in Huntsville encouraged the city to do more community outreach because it's great to run your shelter well, but you've got to find ways to keep those animals in the existing homes so they're not coming in to begin with.
You made me think of something. I'm going to throw this past Alan. I think we have a minute or two left. When we're looking at the data today, it's kind of interesting where we're getting that data. So I think that we have a lot of progressive shelters that are putting out this data. You look at Pima and Austin, which are, probably, a large percentage of these numbers coming through. Well, they're very progressive. So we're not really looking at data from across the country because there's no way to actually capture that. So even when this changes afterwards, it may look pretty rosy if we're not looking at, all shelters, both progressive and regressive. What do you think that'll actually do? What do you think, Alan? I mean, just about that general idea.
Well, I think I should preface the data I talked about before was coming from PetPoint. So one should understand that PetPoint does definitely have some kill shelters provide to it, a lot of kill shelters. Probably the really worst shelters in the country probably aren't sending data to PetPoint, so there may be some anomalies with individually really bad shelters killing more animals now. But more to your point, I think when I look at the data, I still see regressive shelters having this trend. So just on Friday, on my page, NJ Animal Observer, Facebook, I made a post about animal control centers of NYC or New York ACC, which is a very regressive shelter, and they've reduced their intake by something like 65% since February, from April to February. So I think this intake reduction is happening even good and bad shelters as well. And one thing so I think, and their kill rate actually went up since February, which is
Wow.
which is the opposite of what we saw in the aggregate trends of Pet Point, which shows live release rates increasing since the pandemic started. So I think that's one thing to look at. I think I would look at individual shelters, how they perform during coronavirus compared to the aggregate Pet Point data. And if you see the opposite trend or not as strong of a positive trend happening, then that may be an indicator that, yeah, this is still a regressive shelter.
Well, and I think something we've said from the beginning is when the pandemic started, that shelters were going to fall in one of two categories. Shelters that were already even moderately progressive, they would take this time to really get creative and really find ways where they could engage in life-saving, because for them, it's a mission. I mean, it's what they're about. And then shelters that have routinely killed and used excuses for that, they were just going to use this as one more excuse. And you know what? New York is a perfect example. I saw the same thing, Alan. It's mind-boggling to me that the intake would go down so much, and yet the percentage of animals destroyed would go up. I just think that the cream has risen to the top, and shelters that have just always seen animals as expendable, and they use the word euthanasia improperly, they're just using this as a reason to kill, and I think that's just going to continue moving forward.
Well, and animal care centers at NYC, there was news articles that came out like a month ago that said 1,200 people sought to foster an animal from NYACC, and the NYACC said, no, we only need 200. So what happened to 1,000 people? They still killed animals despite those 1,000 people wanting to foster animals. So I think that says a lot of why they're still killing.
That's a shame. I got to stop you there because we're out of time. This has been a great conversation. If you have animal statistics from your local municipality, please post them below, or your comments on what we had talked about today. I'm sure we're going to be talking about this again in the future. This has been No Kill in Motion by the No Kill Movement. I was joined by Aubrie Kavanaugh and Alan Rosenberg. I'm David Smith. We're going to see you next time. Thanks.